This formal type of garden may be popular with humans, but it's not much good for wildlife. That mower, for example, makes sure nothing interesting survives in this lawn. And a tightly clipped foreign shrub like this isn't nearly as good for wildlife as a native field maple. A lot of the flowers are hybrids, so precious and delicate they can only survive with the help of chemical sprays. Now, there's nothing wrong with formal gardens, but they're only one approach. This is my garden, and I grow lots of exotic flowers, but I prefer a bit less formality. So I mix them together, a bit like a traditional cottage garden, with one plant growing through the next and a constant change from season to season. But my garden's just a bit different. It's still full of colour, but because I'm trying to attract as much wildlife as possible, I'm planting things like this teasel, because the goldfinches just love the seed in the autumn. And this whole flower border has been planted up with the sorts of things which are really rich in pollen and nectar. And because I don't spray with any sorts of garden chemicals, it's absolutely alive with insects in the summer. Some of the plants are natives, like this hedge woundwort. The smaller species of bees and hoverflies feed constantly from its little purple flowers. There's room for the biggest, buzziest bumblebee in the flowers of Canterbury bells. And this is a garden scabious actually called butterfly blue. So this part of the garden's a really good service station for all kinds of passing wildlife. But the other end of the garden's quite different, because there I'm creating real mini habitats. I've got my very own little wildflower meadow, and that's surrounded by a sort of woodland edge of silver birch and hazel. My meadow's particularly pleasing because I can grow some of the wildflowers that used to be common in hayfields before the days of chemical agriculture. And already meadow brown butterflies are breeding here. But the real centrepiece of my wildlife garden is the wetland habitat. This pond and marsh have only been here for 3 years, but they're already a real magnet to all kinds of wildlife. Some of the plants that grow around the water's edge are particularly pretty. Lesser spearwort, brook lime, and water forget-me-not, for instance. I actually planted most of the vegetation, but it is amazing how quickly a new pond attracts all kinds of animal life. Frogs, toads and newts all breed here, and I think the most magical creatures of all are the damselflies, which you often see in mating pairs. Big hawker dragonflies laid their eggs in the pond the very first year. They start life down in the water as an ugly-looking nymph, which grows bigger and bigger, snapping up hundreds of tadpoles and almost anything else that moves. Now, after 2 or 3 years underwater, they're leaving the pond, crawling up the stems of waterside plants and performing a miracle right here in my own wildlife garden. And it's not just a summer wildlife garden, it's a real lifesaver in the winter. I try to make sure there's plenty of food around, and it's not all on the bird table either. We have an apple tree, and we always leave the windfalls on the lawn to attract winter visitors. They're a great favourite with the fieldfare. That's a grey-headed thrush that comes to us from Scandinavia. And we've got plenty of fruiting shrubs with berries on too. Redwings strip the pyracantha as soon as they arrive from the frozen north. There's brilliant colour in the garden when the local goldfinches arrive to demolish the teasel and thistle seeds. We get flocks of siskins on the bags of peanuts once their favourite alder seed runs out. And it gives me a real thrill to know that, like so many of my winter garden birds, the siskins have flown here from as far away as Norway and even Siberia. Winter wildlife gardens really do save lives, and they help with conservation on an international scale. Starlings are long-distance travellers too. Over 30 million of them migrate here every autumn, and most of them seem to turn up for a quick dip in the garden pond at the end of every winter's afternoon. They need clean, fluffy feathers to keep out the cold. And when the splashing's over, my starlings head for Birmingham New Street because they know it's warmer on the wild side of town.
Chris Baines will be back on the wild side of town at the same time on Tuesday. And the July edition of the BBC Wildlife magazine contains a supplement on the wild side of town with details of urban safaris and a competition in which you can win wildlife holidays and video cameras.
In Spotlight, in half an hour's time, the high flyer Richard Branson settles on Plymouth for his next dream project, the Admiral's Cup Challenge. And the show that brought the roof down, the EastEnders, Dirty Den and All, Save a Man's Life. That's in Spotlight tonight at 6:35 here on BBC One.
Over on BBC Two now, there's tennis from Wimbledon, where Pat Cash is playing Jimmy Connors. This is BBC One.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Nicholas Witchell and Philip Hayton.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The Moors murderer Ian Brady has been taken back to the Moors by police. Brady spent much of the day there taking part in the search for another body. Across the Atlantic and into the record books, Richard Branson is almost home. He's heading for Scotland and looking for somewhere to land. The verdict on Klaus Barbie is expected this evening. He was ordered back into court to hear it. Also tonight, Prince Charles and the inner cities. He's called for a new crusade and he's had a go at the professionals. Through the looking glass, the new way to catch a criminal. And catching on, for those who can afford it, tennis in the Soviet Union. Shortly before dawn this morning, the convicted murderer Ian Brady was taken to Saddleworth Moor above Oldham. The Home Secretary had given his permission. The moor was sealed off by police, and for nearly 12 hours, Brady and a party of detectives searched the moor. They were looking for the grave of Keith Bennett, a 12-year-old boy who disappeared from his home 23 years ago. Brady and his accomplice Myra Hindley were convicted in 1966 of the crimes known as the Moors murders, the killing of 2 children and a youth. It was suspected then and has been believed ever since that Brady and Hindley took the details of 2 other killings to their prison cells with them. 2 days ago, police found what's believed to be one of the missing bodies. Yesterday, Brady said he was ready to try to find the last one. Today, in handcuffs, he returned to the moor. Tonight, he's back in Park Lane Mental Hospital near Liverpool. Brady took the police to the area of moorland known as Shiny Brook. Detectives now believe they should soon be able to bring the Moors murder inquiry to a conclusion. Reporting from the moor, Neil Bennett.
There was none of the intensive, highly visible security surrounding Myra Hindley's return to Saddleworth. 2 police vans had slipped onto the moors and dropped off their passengers before dawn. Soon after, the group was seen making for Shiny Brook. These, the first pictures of Ian Brady's return to the moors after 24 years. At first, his presence wasn't suspected. Then, as police began stopping anyone from going onto the moors, it was obvious they'd very quickly taken up his offer to try and help find the body of 12-year-old Keith Bennett. At the approach of the first airborne camera crew, police stopped their work and huddled around Brady to prevent him being picked out from the rest of the party. They'd protected his accomplice Myra Hindley in exactly the same way when she was brought back to the moors last winter. During nearly 12 hours on the moors, Brady took police to several locations. This is hard walking country, and the physical effort took its toll. Here, Brady is sitting down, with police again gathered round to stop him being identified. Throughout the operation, the Manchester Police Tactical Support Unit, some armed, kept patrol to make sure no one got too close. Shortly after 3 o'clock, the search ended. A blanket was put over Brady's head. Then a white Range Rover drove him slowly over the rough track leading off the moors. Finally, Brady was transferred to the police van which took him back to Park Lane Mental Hospital on Merseyside. Travelling with him, Detective Chief Superintendent Topping, the Manchester policeman, hoping information gathered today will lead him to a second body and the end of the Moors murder case.
Ian Brady has been in prison or a secure mental hospital for the last 21 years. Apart from journeys between prisons, this is the first time he's been out since his trial. Brady was last on the moors in 1965. Soon after this picture was taken, he was arrested and charged. In May 1966, he was found guilty of murdering 3 children and sentenced to life. Since then, only one picture of him, taken 2 years ago, has become public. Tonight, Brady's been returned to Park Lane Hospital near Liverpool to continue his sentence. But he said he's ready to go back to the moors.
Richard Branson has very nearly completed his crossing of the Atlantic in his hot air balloon, the Atlantic Flyer. The latest news we have is that he and his co-pilot, Per Lindstrand, are planning to land in Scotland, possibly within the next 2 hours. They've been in the air now for 33 hours and travelled over 3,000 miles. That means they've already broken the record for the longest flight in a hot air balloon, but they've got to touch down on dry land before they can finally claim to have crossed the Atlantic. David Schuckman reports.
4 o'clock this afternoon, 15,000 feet over Northern Ireland, and the Virgin Atlantic Flyer has become the first hot air balloon to cross the Atlantic. Tucked away in their pressurized cabin beneath this massive balloon, Richard Branson and his co-pilot Per Lindstrand have made it from America and into aviation history. As we approach them high over Northern Ireland, they're travelling at about 30 knots and looking good. They've got the Atlantic behind them and only the Irish Sea in front. But there is, of course, the main problem, landing. That was on Per Lindstrand's mind when we made contact this afternoon.
Now that you've crossed the Atlantic, you're the first people to do so in a hot air balloon. You must feel tremendous. Over.
It's not over yet. We've got the worst task ahead of us, landing this seat.
But you must have some sense of relief that you're over the big pond anyway.
There's no doubt about that.
But this final stage hasn't been plain sailing. In thick cloud cover without the warming rays of the sun, the balloon lost height rapidly, and it's said that 2 fuel tanks had to be jettisoned. Local people claim that at one stage they saw the balloon touch the ground. Now, though, it's said to be heading for Scotland.
Branson and Lindstrand's progress has been plotted from the Flight Control Centre at the top of the British Telecom Tower in London. As our aviation correspondent Christopher Wayne reports, there's mounting excitement there as touchdown approaches.
Throughout the day, the progress of the flight had been monitored from this communications centre on the 33rd floor of London's Telecom Tower. Once the balloon had made landfall over Ireland, the most dangerous part of the flight was over, but not the difficulties. Landing a balloon that's higher than Nelson's column requires a special technique.
They will jettison their canopy by explosive bolts, so they won't get dragged far. So we're hoping they'll find a big enough area of grassland to do this in. If they haven't found a large enough space without power wires, without a busy motorway, or without a built-up area, they're going to be probably up in the Highlands, landing in very awkward terrain. So we've got to pray they find a whacking great big playing field somewhere that they are blown towards, because, as you know, they can't steer the balloon.
For Richard Branson, the businessman, the prize has been a huge amount of publicity for his airline. For Richard Branson, the millionaire adventurer, it's meant risking his life for a place in aviation's history books. Whatever may be planned for the future, the journey won't be repeated with this balloon. The Virgin Atlantic Flyer was designed for just one journey, but that has been the longest in the history of hot air ballooning.
Well, Chris Wayne sending that report from the Balloon Control Centre just a few moments ago. And now, to get the very latest news, we go to him live. Chris, what is the latest from the control centre there?
Well, Nick, the latest position is that she is about 100 miles from touchdown. She's now expected to be touching down somewhere in Scotland at about 8:30 this evening. At the moment, the aircraft is varying in height between 6,000 feet and about 10,000 feet. They're practicing landings because she's only ever going to make one landing, this balloon, and they're anxious to get things right. So at the moment, they're going up and down, trying to get the technique right.
They're obviously busy with those preparations. As you've said, the touchdown is the most difficult part. Do they have any idea where in Scotland they are likely to land?
Well, at the moment, they think just somewhere near the Prestwick area, but at the moment, it's fairly uncertain. This is, after all, varying with the elements, and as she comes down lower, she's being blown further north. But at the moment, it looks as though it's going to be fairly close to Prestwick. One interesting thing is that she has, of course, to go through customs when she touches down, so Prestwick Airport would be very convenient.
Chris, we'll be keeping track with you of developments during the programme, but for the moment, thank you very much indeed.
Within the next few hours, the verdict is expected in the trial of Klaus Barbie, the alleged butcher of Lyon. He's charged with committing crimes against humanity. Barbie was the Gestapo chief in Lyon between 1942 and 1944, a time when thousands were sent to death camps in Germany. At the heart of the prosecution case is the charge that Barbie was responsible for deporting at least 800 Jews and resistance workers. Half later died in concentration camps. They claim he was responsible for rounding up 44 Jewish children from their foster home near Lyon. All died in Auschwitz. And he is accused of frequently torturing resistance prisoners. Barbie was forced to return to the courtroom today after boycotting most of the 8-week trial. He made a dramatic final statement, dismissing the deportation charges. He said, "It was the war, and the war is over." This report from our diplomatic editor, John Simpson in Lyon.
The morning of the day on which Klaus Barbie was to hear the judgment of the court found him in St. Joseph's prison in Lyon, the place where, as a Gestapo officer, he'd sent so many of the people he'd arrested. His lawyer, by contrast, was in more comfortable quarters at a Lyon hotel, as he left to bring his defense of Barbie to a close in court.
I shall ask the acquittal of my client, and I trust still the French justice.
On the rooftops, members of the special police squad kept watch over the court, prudently secured by a harness, while the other actors in the drama arrived below. members of the jury who would be judging Barbie's guilt or innocence, the lawyers appearing for the defense and for the prosecution, and a former resistance man and his wife. She daringly staged his release after he'd been captured and tortured by Barbie. People like them have been hoping to get Barbie put on trial ever since the days 40 years ago when he ruled the streets of Lyon.
He escaped at the end of the world, and in spite of that, corresponding to the cliché in the mind, the hand of justice came on Barbie and brought him in Lyon, in the place where he committed crimes. That's the main point of the Barbie case. That means there is a justice.
But when the court assembled this morning, the dock was empty, as it had been ever since the third day of the trial. The judge, as always, ordered that the prisoner should be brought in, but Barbie insisted on staying in his prison. A harassed court official came rushing back in the heat with the news, and the judge accordingly ordered Barbie to be brought by force if necessary. It wasn't. An hour later, the police convoy brought him in. His boycott of the proceedings, which had robbed the trial of much of its dramatic quality and therefore some of its point, was over. After seeing him, Barbie's daughter slipped quietly out of the court, her feelings unchanged about the man whom some people have called the Butcher of Lyon.
I don't see my father. I've never seen him as a butcher. I've seen him as a very kind, very sweet father. Very tender. And for me, all those accusations and defamations are still a war consequence. Maybe I'm feeling like in the war again. For us, the war hasn't finished, neither for my father nor for me and for my husband.
Nor, indeed, for the surviving relatives of the hundreds of Jews and resistance workers, many of whom have listened to this trial throughout. In the sweltering heat of the court, Barbie made a brief, faltering statement in heavily accented French. He denied responsibility for the roundup of Jewish children at a farm outside Lyon and said he never had the power to decide deportations. I fought the resistance with toughness, he said. It was the war. The war is over. So what's happening right now, very different from a British court, is that the judge and the jury, 5 men and 4 women, plus 2 legal assessors, are discussing between themselves, privately, not their overall verdict, but their answers to 341 specific questions about Barbie's guilt or innocence. Their answers to those questions will be added up, and they'll decide the outcome, one way or the other, tonight. This is John Simpson for the 6 o'clock news in Lyon.
Prince Charles has called for a crusade to regenerate Britain's inner cities. He told a meeting of architects in London that there was little time to waste because the problem was too pressing. But as our court correspondent Michael Cole reports, he squashed speculation that he would have a government-appointed role.
The Prince was met by the man often described as his architectural guru, Rod Hackney, the new president of the Royal Institute. But in a humorous speech, the Prince said if he'd sat at the feet of gurus as often as reported, he'd have developed architectural hemorrhoids by now.
Anyway, here I am, robed, sandaled, shaven-headed, and with a rather far-away look in my eye, having eschewed a vehicular conveyance to this salubrious headquarters, and levitated my way here from Kensington Palace instead. But, ladies and gentlemen, I would not have missed this award presentation for anything, I can assure you. It's, after all, one of my rare opportunities to stir things up, to throw a proverbial royal brick through the inviting plate glass of pompous professional pride, and to jump feet first into the kind of spaghetti bolognese of red tape which clogs this country from one end to the other.
The Prince dismissed reports that he is to have a role in the government's campaign in the inner cities. He'll continue to work through the Prince's Trust and business in the community on visits like the one to the East End this week. He said there was a danger of yuppies moving in, when what was really needed was a scheme of good, low-cost housing for the people already there.
A scheme like that could provide a model of a sort for the regeneration of blighted inner city wards and a chance to rectify the disastrous phenomenon of suburban sprawl on the one hand and the anonymous wasteland of vast housing estates and soulless, dehumanizing blocks of flats on the other.
Local projects like this one in Liverpool, which have replaced inner-city slums with homes to be proud of, were rewarded with a plaque, a cheque for £1,000, and the Prince's congratulations.
In Belfast, a taxi driver has been shot dead. He's the 6th person to be murdered in the province in 2 weeks. He was Edward Campbell, a 40-year-old Catholic from the Ardoyne area. The police found his body in a quarry this morning on the outskirts of the city.
The latest murder victim was found dumped in a quarry in the hills above Belfast. Edward Campbell, a Catholic taxi driver, was a former internee. He'd been shot in the head and body. The RUC Chief Constable, Sir John Herman, warned of the rising terrorist violence when he inspected new recruits passing out at the training depot in Belfast.
Recent grim events have illustrated only too tragically and clearly the threat from terrorist and paramilitary organisations, that it is very real, and it must be taken with the utmost seriousness and accompanied by a high degree of vigilance on the part of everyone.
Tonight, the Belfast Playmakers Shorts closed their factories, following what management described as 2 days of widespread intimidation. The dispute concerns the flying of loyalist flags inside the plant. Shorts say they will not compromise on the company rules which forbid such displays.
Later in the programme, the latest from Wimbledon and from the Test match. A touch of the tantrums from Ivan Lendl and a touch of class from Neil Foster. Now the time is very nearly 6:18.
The headlines tonight. The Moor's murderer Ian Brady has spent nearly 11 hours on Saddleworth Moor helping police look for the body of a child. Richard Branson's balloon is expected to land in the next hour or two after his record-breaking flight across the Atlantic. Prince Charles has called for a crusade to regenerate Britain's inner cities, but there'll be no government-appointed role for him. Police are trying out a new way of encouraging the victims of crime to attend identity parades. In several areas of the country, they've been using two-way mirrors, so the victim doesn't have to come face-to-face with the suspect. It could be especially useful for the elderly and the victims of sexual attacks. And as our Home Affairs correspondent, Bill Hamilton, reports, the experiment has already shown promising results.
Stop it. Come on in and see these screens, because this is what you're going to be involved with later on. Go behind and have a look yourself, see if you can see me. Can you see me now? No. Not at all?
Georgina Stockley is 72. Alarmed at the number of attacks on pensioners, she's asked Avon Police to show her how they're trying to ease the trauma for elderly victims, many of whom are much too frightened to face their assailant on a normal identity parade. To help prove the effectiveness of their two-way mirrors, the police enlisted the help of 9 young volunteers to stand on the other side. One even agreed to play the part of the suspect. When brought from the cells, he can choose his own position in the lineup. Like the others, he can only see himself in the mirror. Mrs. Stockley, though, can see everything. Already, the experiment in Bristol is showing that by putting the victim more at ease, the number of positive identifications has increased.
Number 6.
Number 6 is the one.
Well, I'm very encouraged by the results of this experiment. The whole force is, so much so that we are in fact building a permanent suite. And I would strongly advise other forces to take advantage of the system.
In fact, police in Merseyside, Manchester, Strathclyde and London are now running similar experiments, hoping for more victims to come forward. Mrs. Stockley, can I ask you what you thought of the experiment?
Well, I've came with an open mind, and I think this is a good idea, because if I had to go on a parade, I would no more go up to anyone and touch them at all. But on this way, I think it's a very good idea.
Backed up by a more sympathetic approach towards victims, Avon and Somerset police believe the two-way mirrors will not just ease fears, but lead to many more convictions in court.
So now to some latest news we have on the flight of the Virgin Atlantic Flyer. Our reporter, who's in a plane off the northern coast of Northern Ireland, has said that the balloon has touched the water off the coast of Antrim. It's now near the water, and we're told that a search and rescue helicopter has been requested to stand by. These are pictures which were taken earlier this afternoon of the balloon clearly above the clouds there, heading for Scotland. The latest news, though, as I say, is that it has touched the water off the coast of Northern Ireland. We're just hoping to get more details on that. We'll bring them to you as soon as we have them. Phil.
18 Mexicans who were being smuggled illegally into the United States have died from suffocation after being trapped in an airtight railway carriage. They were locked in at the border by a professional smuggler, and it's assumed he'd arranged for them to be let out by an accomplice further up the line. But the plan went wrong when the train was taken into a siding